You didn't build a great business by being timid. And now it's time to get back to business the same way you built it, with passion. UBS is here with the resources and knowledge you need today. We've weathered the storm with business owners for more than 150 years, and what we've learned can help you right now, not just for your own personal goals, for your business. With insights and strategies to help you get up and running with the focus and determination that made you a success in the first place. It's a matter of asking the right questions and speaking with the right people who can help you find the solutions to move your business forward. With UBS, the possibilities are endless, but the focus is always on you, your family, and your business. Why not benefit from all of the knowledge and resources available to you from UBS? Few people could have built what you built. Proceed with passion.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Shirley Leung, and I'm a columnist with the Boston Globe. We've got a terrific lineup of panelists today to talk about an important topic, building Black wealth. We're gathering today, which marks the beginning of a week-long celebration of Juneteenth in Boston. Closing the racial wealth gap is critical to achieving equity, and we'll be tackling the issue from a high level about policies and systemic changes down to individual choices about careers and entrepreneurship. We'll be in conversation with Boston entrepreneurs, Herbie Duvernay and Melissa James, as well as UMass Boston economist Dania Francis. But before we begin our conversation, we're going to hear some opening remarks from our sponsor, UBS. Here is Mel Hightower. She's managing director, and she heads up the Multicultural Investor Strategic Client segment for UBS Global Wealth Management. Good to see you, Mel.
Good to see you, Shirley. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today. And good afternoon to everyone who's taking time out of their day to tune in. So on behalf of UBS Global Wealth Management, I'd really like to thank you for joining us today. And I hope you are as excited for this discussion as I am. As Shirley mentioned, I head up the Multicultural Investor segment, and our mission is really to champion the future of wealth. And we are specifically focused on meeting the needs of Black, Asian, and Hispanic and Latino investors through unparalleled access to people, ideas, and solutions that will help them on their wealth journey. Today's discussion is particularly important as Juneteenth approaches. It's been more than 150 years since that fateful day in 1865 when enslaved Black people in Galveston, Texas, learned of the Emancipation Proclamation, which had occurred more than 2.5 years earlier. For many of us, Juneteenth recognizes freedom realized. It also signifies the continued fight of Black people in the US for equity and equality, freedom from not only intentional discrimination, but also systemic racism. We need look no further than our own financial system for evidence of this phenomenon. Until fairly recently, few banks, brokerage firms, trust companies, any financial firm you can think of existed to serve multicultural investors, and that limited many investors' full market participation. We at UBS recently surveyed 3,000 multicultural millionaires, and we found that while the vast majority of them are building wealth faster than their parents, they've also experienced inequity firsthand. For example, 1 in 2 Black millionaires say that they've felt discrimination from financial institutions. 1 in 2. It comes as no surprise then that many multicultural investors are charting their wealth journey outside of the financial system, out of the traditional investing in stocks and bonds. For example, 57% of Black investors are looking to real estate, and it's a critical cornerstone of their wealth journey. At the same time, nearly 20% of Black millionaires have built wealth through entrepreneurship, and that number only goes up when you look at Black women in particular. And these different paths could also include investing as well. No matter your path to wealth, it's important that you make an informed decision. Should we wish to build the generational wealth that we all seek, it's critical that we have this conversation about the racial wealth gap and building Black wealth. I'd like to extend my thanks to today's panelists, Herbie Duvernay, Melissa James, and Dania Francis. Thank you so much for participating in today's discussion. And finally, I invite you to learn more about UBS's research on Black investors and share with us your own wealth journey at ubs.com/invest-to-advance. Visitor resources on business owners as well as entrepreneurship is your pathway to ubs.com/business owner. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. You are in for a treat for an incredible discussion. Back to you, Shirley.
As always, thank you, Mel, and thank you to UBS for your partnership and your leadership on creating wealth for all. We have been talking about creating wealth for everyone all year long. So this is just the latest installment. So I'm hoping that I'm hoping our panelists can start to turn on their cameras and unmute themselves. I'm going to introduce you guys alphabetically. First, we have Herbie Duvernay. Hi, Herbie.
How are you, Shirley?
And Herbie is the CEO of Windwalker Group, a Boston firm that specializes in cybersecurity, physical security, and as well as professional services. Herbie, being the serial entrepreneur that he is, he also has, he's also co-founded another company. It's called Rise Together. It's a certified minority business construction and development company, and it's been making a lot of headlines. So welcome, Herbie.
Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Dania Francis. You want to wave, Dania? She's an economics professor at University of Massachusetts, Boston. Her research focuses on racial disparities and the economics of education. She's a graduate of Smith College, and she also received a master's from Harvard and her doctorate from Duke University. Welcome, Dr. Francis.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then we have Melissa James. She is the founder of The Tech Connection, a firm that helps companies recruit diverse talent in the tech industry. I got to know Melissa as a co-founder of Hack Diversity. It's an intern to hire program that helps Black and Latino students from underrepresented institutions like community colleges and universities to get their first internship at a top tier tech company. Also, you know, in the time that I've talked to Melissa, she's also written a book. She's also an author, and she wrote a book on when are you going to get a real career, a guide to designing a career you would be proud of. And I think it's a roadmap for millennials on how to jumpstart their careers. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we kick off a week-long celebration of Juneteenth in Boston. I'm going to start off with some questions, including some that were pre-submitted from the audience. We'll also be taking live questions during the webinar. So folks in the audience, please send your questions through the Q&A function. The chat has been turned off. So again, please go through the Q&A function. And then as I mentioned to the panelists earlier, based on the questions we've gotten so far, and we've gotten a lot of good questions, I think some folks are hoping to be on the path to being millionaires by the end of this panel. So the bar is really high today, all right? We'll check in a year or 5 years from now to see how the audience is doing and how their net worth is doing. But anyways, I thought of this conversation in a few buckets. entrepreneurship, better paying jobs and careers, ownership, and systemic changes. And each of you bring that element or to the table. So since we have two entrepreneurs on the panel, I wanted to start there. What made you decide, I'm going to start my own business and this is how I'm going to achieve financial success? Herbie, I was wondering if you could talk about your incredible journey.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Shirley. And plus, Shirley, thank you very much. And thank you for everything you do to advocate for the right thing, which is equity and so forth. And also, what a pleasure to be with some wonderful panel. I'm Melissa, whom that I met many years and so forth. I would say the way it was my journey in this country. I came in this country when I was 20 years old without a word of English and didn't go to school here. And then basically I quickly realized that I have to work just like most immigrants do. We work very hard. I've done every type of job you can think of, from cleaning at Harvard University. I always tell people I went to Harvard, but I actually was a custodian at Harvard. That's the proper name. They call it cleaner at Harvard. So cleaning at Harvard, doing the taxi drivers and everything else. And I continue doing the path of the journey in America, which is do everything you can, get to school. I went to Northeastern University. I got a bachelor's degree. I got a master's degree. I got a wonderful job from State Street to Massport. And I quickly realized when I was at Massport, even though I had all this education, even though I worked so hard, I get, that far. And I realized I was really working just to pay my bills. Even at that level, everybody around me had a second house. Everybody around me have their kids' education already paid or puts money on the side. And then I was the only one paying debt and paying everything that, even though I was making good money at the time. And at least in my head, I knew I was making good money. And then I realized that the only way to get out of this thing is to do my own business. It just clicked to me by talking to other people. It's clicked to me by just listening. And then, one of the things that one of the theme about me, if one thing everybody want to remember is I almost feel that you have to see yourself in a village as you work in this country, right? Your village, you always got people that mentors that you can talk to, friends that you can rely on, business partners, politicians you can talk to, supported. So being in that village, I've been talking to people. I talked to a lot of people about, what I need to do. And then people say, a lot of friends that already done entrepreneurship and feel that the right things for me to do is become an entrepreneur. It's just like, because I was already working hard. I was already done the school. I got the relationship. I know the one thing that really can set me apart and get me to go fast, because as you know, given you not from here, you're an immigrant, you starting way behind. So I really have to really speed up the process for me. And then that's what I did. I decided to do my own business. I decided to grow a company from really 3 people to almost 200 people in my security company and my training companies. We've done $15+ million of business, and also doing real estate as well with my business partner, doing over $700 million of real estate development. So it's like, again, this is a phenomenal story, and thank you, Shirley, for mentioning that. But really what I think really that's make that happen is just the knowledge, knowing that I had to set outside the box and do something different so I can really speed that up as an entrepreneur. That's the reason that I did that, and that's what got me here as an entrepreneur.
Thank you, Herbie. Very inspiring story. And I actually, as many times I've talked to you, I'm just learning more and more every time about your backstory. Now, Melissa, you have a similar story. I mean, you had a really good, I think you were at Google, right? You had a good paying job as well. And then you decided to hang your own shingle. Tell us about that.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Shirley. There's so much of Herbie's story that resonates with me. I certainly understand what I call the immigrant hustle of wanting to, you have this really big vision of wanting to be successful, but not exactly sure how to get there. I certainly grew up the daughter of 2 immigrants. My mom is from Jamaica. My dad is from St. Kitts Nevis. So I watched them do exactly what Herbie described, working 2 jobs every single day, knowing that getting us into the right community was the right place, but they didn't really know so what's the next step? What are you supposed to do? And they kind of sent the message go to college and then everything should be fine. So for my family, they believe that like, as long as we made it there, that was it. And unfortunately, as you go through the process, you realize that college is just a ticket to the dance. It's just the opportunity for you to learn more, to get a framework for understanding information, but it doesn't actually resolve all of the information that you need to be successful. So as I went through undergrad, I was always just super curious about like, what's that next thing that I'm going to do? What's that next thing that I need to become? And then of course, I graduated in 2010 from UMass Amherst in the middle of the economic recession, where I had to reinvent myself, where I had to really think strategically about like, what am I going to do next? Initially, I was on my way to law school thinking like, if I could just become a lawyer, that would be it. You know, coming from an immigrant household, you can be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or a nurse. I didn't like blood and I didn't like math, so that canceled out two of them. Being a lawyer was next, but I had to think hard on that. Going to law school would have been taking on $200,000 worth of debt. And at that time, lawyers were struggling to find a job. So I had to kind of think like, what is the thing that I don't know much about, but I'm curious to learn? What could it be that could help propel me to the next level? And I decided that it would be business. And for me, I actually worked at a startup that was a spin out from MIT and Harvard. It was called Sample 6 at that time as their office manager. And I worked directly underneath the CEO so that I could learn more about how to run a business. And it was the best foundational learning that I could have ever asked for. I learned, I always say that I got my degree in the School of Hard Knocks because there was so much that I learned from being around them, how they think, how their ideas are, how they bring their businesses to fruition. And through that example, I worked there for 2 years under Michael Kores, who was the best manager that I could ever ask for. He was a full support of me and gave me any project he didn't want to do was my homework. So I was presenting to the board, I was presenting to the executive management team all throughout my career, and that was powerful. I didn't realize it then, but it was certainly a strong indication of where I would be headed in my career. And from there, I got a job at Google working on their diversity recruitment team. Certainly grateful for the opportunity, but again, it was, okay, great, I'm here. So what's next? And I very quickly learned that large scale organizations are fantastic, but there's a certain time and place for when you want to be at a large scale company. So I read this book called The Wealth Choice by Dennis Kimbrough, and I learned a lot more about how do Black people become self-made millionaires. He did a study of over 1,000 self-made Black millionaires, and it really talked a lot about how real estate and entrepreneurship play a large component of that. So for me, I decided to really focus on like, one, what's a cause that I care a lot about? Helping people understand how important their job is, because the work that we do is our greatest expression of ourselves and what we choose to be. So for me, that was something that was important. That job at Sample 6 changed my life. It changed the trajectory of my family. So I care a lot about making sure people find really great jobs and getting access to opportunity. And then lastly, real estate was important to me. So I've now become a real estate investor. I have 2 multifamilies that I own, and it's been fantastic to reach that net worth of over $1 million. So excited.
Thank you, Melissa. It's again, always inspiring hearing your backstory as well. So I'm going to bring in the economist now. So Dania, is entrepreneurship the best way to build wealth? We've just heard these 2 inspiring stories. I mean, but at the same time, you have to have a high tolerance for risk. And I mean, not everyone succeeds, right?
That's right. And I do just want to say thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Boston Globe and UBS for sponsoring this conversation. Right. I think entrepreneurship is important, right? Because it's another form of ownership, and ownership is a path to greater wealth, owning capital, owning the means of production, and so on. But I'm glad you brought up this issue of risk tolerance, right? Because entrepreneurship absolutely carries it with it these risks of failure. And as I'm sure we're going to talk about in more detail, I'm someone who studies structural barriers to Black wealth accumulation. So I feel I would be remiss if I didn't point out how the current and historic racial wealth gap acts as an additional impediment to Black entrepreneurship, right? So having wealth or coming from wealth acts as a safety net, right? Or a backstop for entrepreneurs. So if you have wealth or you have access to intergenerational wealth, you may feel more free to take risks, right? Because the consequences of failure are hedged by that wealth safety net, right? But for Black families that do not have that wealth, entrepreneurship comes with greater personal and family risks, right? Failure, which again is a regular part of entrepreneurship. We have excellent success stories here, right? But failure is a part of it. And when you fail, you get back up again, and so on and so forth. But it also means for low wealth families that that failure could mean a family doesn't eat, right? Or becomes housing insecure. Right. So in fact, Black entrepreneurs who don't have that safety net or that wealth backstop actually have a higher tolerance for risk than entrepreneurs who have that wealth to rely on. And so I take this as sort of evidence in direct contradiction to those who would say, well, racial wealth gaps are due to a lack of Black entrepreneurship, right? Or risk tolerance, right? So I guess long story short, I would say entrepreneurship is important for building Black wealth. But encouraging Black entrepreneurship alone will not make a substantial dent in the racial wealth gap, in part because of the role of intergenerational wealth in promoting entrepreneurship among those who already have wealth.
Mm-hmm. That's a great perspective, Dania, and which is a great segue into what Herbie and I have been talking about recently about being an entrepreneur of color. I mean, in this post George Floyd era, I mean, do you feel like it's better? Do you feel like you get more opportunities?
No, not necessarily. I will say, and it, it's still very hard, and I agree with you, Dania. I think, one of the things that worked for me based on the point that you made is the fact that given where I came from in Haiti and how poor that we were in Haiti, so I have a different perspective, different from a lot of people that perhaps were born here, because I have a perspective second. My life was so poor that I know that when I came here, there's no way he can get worse than what he was. So I have this sort of mindset of thinking that grits that you and I talk about, Shirley, that's sort of where I got that, thinking like, well, there's no way that I can be poor than it is. So I'm more tolerant to take as much risk as I can to sort of do that. But you're absolutely right, Shirley. It's not easy, even though I like to think I'm well known in the community. I do a lot of, I participate in a lot of different things. But even to that point, I'm on the chambers, I'm in different business organization. Shirley and I talk about a lot. Even it's very hard to still break those systematic barriers to organization. I talked to Shirley before about, we have organizations that just have a checkbox. They say, well, yeah, you're an entrepreneur, we want to give you business, but we're just going to call you. We're going to ask you to bid. We're going to ask you to send an RFP. And at the end, they don't really do the right thing. At the end, it's just a circle that, just like it doesn't really happen. So it's not easier. It's still a lot of systematic barriers that many of us need to be a lot of great things. We talk about the Massport models, the city and Mayor Wu actually is doing a lot of great things to push that, to break the barriers, to ensure that more opportunities open. We sort of have to legislate those things, unfortunately, because it's not easy for organizations to say, some people are doing great. I know many companies doing excellent, but a lot of companies are not. So we need to sort of force organizations to do the right thing so we can ensure that our people do better.
Mm-hmm. Melissa, what has been your experience? Have you post Floyd?
I certainly think that there's a big space in the market for education and awareness right now. I think many organizations are just waking up to the idea of equity. Many people are still trying to define it. What is equity? What does that mean? I didn't realize I was doing something different to one group than another. So that's where we are when it comes to the market. And I think sometimes I have to sit back and reflect that like not everybody is on this journey. Although we've been having and living this experience individually, some people are just now waking up. And it's been 2 years since the death of George Floyd. I think many people are still processing, to be quite frank, on what does it mean to be a more equitable leader? What does it mean to be a more inclusive leader? And how can I create change, whether it's through an organization or through our everyday business practices? So I think we've got a long road ahead, is what I see. And I think that folks are curious to create solutions, very grateful that Mel exists. I'm sure that didn't happen. I'm sure that role is relatively new, and, grateful that there is somebody spearheading this type of work on the other end, working at things. But like, it just takes a long time when you realize that someone's just now, or as a society that we're just now opening up our eyes.
Right. So let's stay on the top. Let's stay on the topic of ownership, and we just talked about owning your own business, and let's talk about building wealth through real estate, which Mel cited as a very almost a preferred method to kind of make money for Black families and Black investors. So, Dania, let's start with the big picture first. I mean, home ownership, real estate investment, it's this preferred path to wealth for Black families, yet it's not easy. It's, what do you see as the structural barriers that prevent Black people from being homeowners, and what can be done to eliminate those barriers?
Yeah, so I mean, we can draw a connecting line from discriminatory New Deal and post-World War II era laws and policies at the federal, state, and local levels to current racial wealth gaps, right? And that connecting link is state-sanctioned exclusion of Black Americans from investing in wealth-generating assets, right? And this was during the time of one of the most prosperous times in the history of this country. Policies like redlining that excluded Black families from home ownership, Black veterans being denied access to their GI benefits when trying to buy a home because VA benefits were locally administered, urban renewal projects that bulldozed middle-class Black neighborhoods, homes, and businesses, exclusionary zoning practices. I could go on, right? So these are all, and I'm not even listing, sort of the individual or specific company level discrimination. This is the government's hand in this, right? And so some people say, well, why dwell on the past, right? Let's talk about what we can do today to address these issues. But the path is highly relevant. The wealth disparities that opened up at that time in history, right, continue and persist up until this time for three reasons. One, intergenerational wealth transfers, right? This is parents and grandparents transferring wealth to their children. And so, and it doesn't just happen in the incidence of, passing on wealth through wills or things like that. It happens when your grandparents help pay for your private school tuition or college tuition. It happens when your parents help you with a down payment to buy into an opportunity neighborhood, right? So their grandchildren can have access to good schools, right? These are the ways that wealth, right, that Blacks were excluded from in the past is passed down intergenerationally. The second part is that the ability to use wealth generates more wealth, right? So it's not just that we pass down that same amount of wealth through generations, right? But that wealth grows wealth, right? So that wealth opened up, right, even larger gaps. And so, Black families were excluded from being able to invest in businesses, real estate, et cetera. And then I think the final leg on this is that we can't just think about this as something in the past, because institutional discrimination is ongoing, right? New studies come out every week demonstrating discrimination in labor markets, real estate markets, the criminal justice system, education settings, and so on, right? Institutional discrimination is not a thing of the past. It still exists, and it's still serving as a barrier to Black wealth accumulation.
So Dini, if you could wave a magic wand, how would you eliminate, kind of fast track and eliminate these barriers, or some of the barriers? If there's like one or two things that could be done.
Yeah, so I think what we have to do is be more engaged in policies at all levels, right? Sometimes you think the way to affect change is, at this like large, national sort of federal involvement, but really a lot of what happens that excludes people from these opportunities is happening at local levels, right? Your local zoning board, making decisions that say, you can't buy into this town unless you own an acre lot, right? Well, who is that excluding, right? That's excluding low wealth people who are disproportionately Black and brown, right? So there are ways that people who are in those towns, who are allies, right, can use their power and use their position to advocate against those types of zoning policies and avoid that type of, NIMBYism, not in my backyard, right? Those are ways that it's not a magic wand, it's not overnight. This didn't happen overnight, right? But it's necessary, I think, to affect systematic change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's switch gears and talk about creating better paying jobs. So Melissa, this has been your life's work, really, and so what have you learned about diverse tech talent and building a bigger pipeline? What do you learn from all the work you've done with your own company and also with Hack Diversity?
Absolutely. So what I've learned from diversity recruitment is that, when we're going through college, oftentimes we use our grade point average as our way to assess whether or not someone's super smart or brilliant. But for diverse candidates, it's really a different type of GPA. It's their grit, it's their perseverance, it's their ambition. And oftentimes that's not written on your resume. It's kind of hard to figure out, but really wanting to sit back and reflect, what did they learn through the life experiences that they've had? What are transferable skills that can be applied to this new job opportunity that they're looking at? So oftentimes I always say that you need to get to know the candidate beyond their resume. It's not just, oh, I worked here as a custodian at Harvard. What is it that they were doing? Were they learning a second language? Were they also working as a cleaner and also working a third job as well? Like, what was that like for them? What was their lived experiences that they had? Because if you told me that full story, that sounds like someone that can multitask really well. Someone that's really good at compartmentalizing, like, this is what I got to get done. I can handle and be a really great project manager in the future, because I know that if there's a goal that needs to be achieved, there's a lot of moving parts that I need to make sure that I can control to get to that end goal. So for me, it's really helping candidates to really think strategically about what skills did you acquire, and also helping hiring managers to think differently about how we read resumes, how we get to know the individual, because it's not just about the work experience that you have, it's also about the story that came with it. So for me, I've learned a lot about that grit, perseverance, and ambition, and helping candidates articulate their story.
Mm-hmm. Now, what from an employer point of view, when you have applicants, apply, like, is there a way employers can, I guess, kind of, how do they surface those stories that aren't captured, in a resume? I mean, it's one thing to put the onus on applicants, but what about the onus on employers? What can they do?
Yeah. It's really kind of thinking differently about how do we ask questions during interviews, what information comes to the forefront. At Tech Connection, we use personality-based matching for job descriptions. So it really helps bring together like that core of like who I am as an individual in a quick and fast way, and then applying it to job opportunities. So we look at like, what are the personality traits that you have and how it aligns to a job description so that we can have better matching. But ultimately, it's also for the hiring manager to have that education and awareness that it's not just what their work experience is, it's more so getting to know the individual and what are transferable skills that candidate can have. So being more inclusive when we ask questions, it's not just about where you've been, but give me an example of a time where you had to overcome something hard. What did you do? How did you go about it? What were the tasks that you needed to complete? What were the action steps that you took? What were the results that you need to achieve? So oftentimes employers come in with like, I need someone to solve my problem today, but give that chance, give that candidate a chance to share their own lived experience as a way for them to articulate why they'd be a good fit for that opportunity.
Shirley, I will add to this saying that, on the employee side, one thing I will add to this, and by the way, Melissa, I love that GPA phenomenon. This is really great. So I'm going to hopefully use that again. I think it's important for people out there who are trying to get a better job to really try to build that village that I talked about earlier. Try to get to know people before you even need that job, because I think that's one of the ways they're going to really understand your grit, your perseverance, and your ambition through that relationship. It's not enough to you just apply for a job. It's such a short period of time. As someone who has a company that hire people a lot, it's very difficult to try to hire people in that small time frame that you have and to learn all those things about them, that great perseverance and ambition. So I will say to people who's on the line, who's seeing, who's listening, to really try to do that in a way to get to know people, build your village before you need that job. If you know you're gonna want to work for a financial institution, get to know financial institution organization, senior people, so they can get to know you, understand that, wow, I didn't know that story about you. Wow, I didn't know you were a custodian before. I didn't know you from an immigrant family. I didn't know you did X, Y, and Z. So they can give you the opportunity.
Herbie, can you also talk a little bit about what developers are doing now, beyond kind of creating construction jobs, but, we have a lot of labs being built, and it seems like developers are trying to, think outside the box. How do we create, beyond construction jobs for people of color?
Absolutely, absolutely. So my firm, Rise Together, we since we started the organization, Jimmy, my Brian, and I, we started the organization, and we have different personal stories, but at the same time, they're sort of almost the same. Jimmy grew up in a housing project. He understands, what it takes for people to really, grow up and everything else. So we really think about how do we think about development in an equitable way. So very few firms been talking about it. A lot of developers in the past, their job is to just build building. They just come up and build a building and that's it, and they move away. Our thing is, how do we build development in a way that equitable, put people at the center of what we do? And what we mean by that is, one is we got affordable housing in the development that we're doing, if there's room for that, unless you're doing unless you're doing a lab only, but if you're doing housing, you need to put affordable in it. Open space in a way that make people's life better, a way for people to get from one point to another way as well. But the other piece of it is a way for people to get job and opportunity, especially in the community that you're affecting, because you're affecting people in the community, the traffic and everything else. So how do you do that? So one of the way we've been doing is collaboration with the community. For example, in Charlestown, the project that we're doing, we are collaborating with Cambridge College to help train people for job and a lot of things. And Melissa might know that because all the statistics showing for every one scientist, there's 10, 12 or so, all the support folks that can get job that's $60,000+. So how do we do that? So that's what we're trying to invest in now, is trying to collaborate with this university and these colleges. We've done that with BFIT on our Parcel 3. We're going to do that in Cambridge College, a way to train and put courses available for people. Because what we don't want to do is get these bio firm here and they say, well, we can't find people. And they're going to speed up and try to find people that's not there. We say, why not ready and get these folks ready so they can get those opportunities? Even things that we're doing and doing English as a second language in Charlestown. So many immigrants don't know how to speak English. We want to put them in a way so they can be successful. So these are the things that we're doing as a way to ensure that more and more people get the opportunity in this job that's coming up.
Great. We have some great questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to start to kind of throw some in. So, this is another pre-submitted question. A topic that has come up is about student debt. And, I love this question. How can a family that is first generation college overcome the wealth gap when they're still paying back college loans? Does one person want to take that on?
I'm guilty as charged. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Melissa. I want to get you on the next question. Go ahead, Melissa.
I certainly still have student loans, but that did not stop me. I think there's a way that it's calculated in your debt to income ratio. When you go to the bank, I know some folks have a ton. Luckily, I only had not too much, but really working hard to get to that down payment. The first down payment was the hardest. At the time I was like, oh my gosh, $15,000. How am I going to do that? And ended up doing exactly what Herbie described, that immigrant hustle all over again, of working 2 to 3 consulting jobs at that time to get that first down payment. So yes, it is certainly something to be aware of, but if you allow it to be a barrier, it can certainly be difficult, but I'll let Dania talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you. Yeah. So I do want to just sort of like pause for a second to acknowledge that right, like I feel my place in what I do and my place in this panel is sort of beating the drum of structural barriers, but that's not to say that your sort of individual activities shouldn't be equally as important in building Black wealth, right? And so the reason that I focus on these structural barriers is because there will be people who do all of these right things, right, who have grit, right, who persevere, right, like who do all of these things, who hustle and still come up against these structural barriers. And they may not even know that they're up against the structural barriers. They may just internalize it and say, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do. Why aren't I succeeding, right? And so part of what I like to do is sort of beat that drum and say, right, like we can do both, right? We can invest and do all of the actions individually that I see a lot of the Q&A are asking, like, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? Right? At the same time, we need to advocate structurally, right? To break down some of these barriers. And one of these barriers is student loan debt. Right. One of the myths of closing the racial wealth gap is, well, the racial wealth gap will close if Black people just get more education. Right. But mathematically, that just doesn't compute because, right, as we go and try to get higher education, we don't necessarily on average have the wealth to fund it. So how do we fund it? We fund it through debt. Right. Well, what is my wealth? My wealth is my net worth. And my net worth are my assets on the one hand, right? But it's what I owe, the debt on the other. And so if going to higher education increases my debt so much more than those individuals who were lucky enough to have that intergenerational wealth, right? Their parents and their grandparents were able to help support them and offset and subsidize some of that cost. We actually see in the data that among college educated and above individuals, the racial wealth gap is bigger, right? For that reason, the math just doesn't math, right? As far as closing the racial wealth gap because of this debt factor. The second reason is because even after we get this college degree, there's still discrimination in labor markets that contribute to wage gaps, racial wage gaps. And so, even though I've gotten that diploma, right? I'm still paid, if I'm a Black male, 87 cents on the dollar to every white male. If I'm a Black female, 60 cents on the dollar for every white male, right? So, and I'm not saying that to say this is hopeless, right? I'm saying keep doing that, right? I have lots of education, and in fact, my job depends on you wanting your education. But at the same time, recognize that we have to continue to address these barriers.
Dania, where are you on canceling student debt? Is that the answer?
Yeah, so it's not like the answer, right? But it is a answer, right? I think it's I'm a proponent, especially since again, this is something that student debt disproportionately negatively affects lower wealth individuals who are disproportionately, right, Black, Brown, Native American, and so on.
Yeah.
So.
All right, so we have Go ahead, Herbie.
No, I was going to say, I agree 100% with you, Diana. I think even all the success that I have thus far, I can clearly see the systematic barriers in front of me all the time. So I agree 100%. So I really, while these success story, Melissa and I and other people that I know, wow, they're doing great. But I think it's important for you, as you mentioned, for people to know that you can do all of these things and still have that. That's the reason, one of the things that I want to mention, for me, one of the things that I decided to do is I want to do advocacy as much as possible. Organization like BECMA, Builder Color Coalition, and also the politician. So I'm very much involved and raise money for different politicians that align with the idea that I have, because I think it's important for us to keep advocating for organization and these politicians to change this policy and those barriers. But I agree with you 100%, even though I've done everything sometime and I'm realizing like there's still a way for me to get that next contract. Even my company, I had to go outside, even though I know a lot of people in the state, I had to go my business outside before I get, reputation, before I came inside and then grow it in Massachusetts. So I agree.
Sure. And just to add on to what Herbie shared, like just as much as there is a success story, I have certainly plenty of stories on the hustle that it took to get there. There were many moments where I was like going through the process of buying my second home, and it's a multifamily in Roxbury, where I was going through that process and still facing racism and discrimination through it. I had to do an appraisal on my first house. And I said, you know what? I'd like to do an appraisal. I'm working with 2 separate companies. I'm going to pay extra just to see what will happen if they come and appraise the house from 2 separate companies. One, I had my dad stand in, appraised lower. One, I had no one stand in, appraised higher. $40,000 difference, same house, just a week apart. After that, I said, no more. I will not put my picture on my phone anymore. When I engage with the appraiser, they're welcome to come to my house. I have no problem, of course they will, but it was just that one example of racism that you go through. And then even on my next house that I just purchased back in April, we had to go through and do a rebuttal on the appraisal because the appraiser decided to use rental comparables that were outside of my zip code. The 02119 zip code is different than 02121. And that's fine. That's totally okay. But he was comparing the rents and then now saying, oh, the purchase price doesn't justify the rents. How does that work? I wouldn't be able to get that house if I didn't rebut the appraisal, have data and facts to support it. And luckily, my lender was willing to go to bat with me because I was very furious and very upset. But these are some of the instances where racism can play a part, even by your zip code, whether or not you can get into home ownership. So certainly there are a lot of systemic issues. I learned a ton going through this process. And when we talk about equity and we think through what does it really mean to have that generational wealth, I learned so much during this process that I wish I had taken out a HELOC prior to going through this process. Had I gone through and taken out a home equity line of credit or even knew what it was, it would have been a lot smoother, a lot faster. But I actually had no idea what it even meant. And I even called my mom, who's been a homeowner for 30 years. And I said, Mom, how come you never told me about HELOC? She said, I don't even know what you're talking about. And she's been a homeowner for 30 years.
Wow. 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 Melissa, thank you for sharing. And if you can believe it, we only have 15 minutes left. So I'm going to go through, I got to burn through a lot of questions, all right, before I hand it over back to Mel. But Dania, I want you just to answer this question because this is your, you know a lot about this topic. We had a couple questions on this on reparations. Can we close the racial wealth gap without reparations? Where do you studied with your thesis advisor actually wrote the book on this topic. So what's your take on reparations?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, but I could talk about this for another 2 hours, right? So my first thing is absolutely check out the book From Here to Equality by William Darity, Sandy Darity, and Christian Mullen. But it's my opinion that no, we can't close the racial wealth gap without a sort of large national, sort of federally funded program like reparations, right? It didn't open overnight. It was the result of historic discrimination over decades and decades, and it's not going to close just by individual efforts, right? So we do need to continue our individual efforts to grow our family wealth, but at the same time advocate for wealth building policy changes, particularly those that address historic discrimination, like reparations.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, so okay, this is either Herbie or for Melissa, one of you, probably Herbie, but how do you advise spouses of entrepreneurs, or maybe it's partners too, who may be risk adverse to manage through the hard times? Herbie, does that have you all over it?
Yes, I know. Probably my wife asked that question. No, I mean it's tough, because my wife, as a matter of fact, is risk adverse, and she's a teacher, and I came from a different background than I do, and it was tough. It was tough to, one of the things that I do is I think open communication is the right way to do that. When I was leaving Massport, my wife was, our second child, actually our third kid, but the last one was just born, and she's like. And all of a sudden I tell her, oh, honey, I'm leaving Massport. She's like, what do you mean you're leaving your company? What's that mean? I was like, well, I think I'm going to do my own thing. She's like, why don't we think about it? So one of the things that I did in terms of communication is, even though I was going to leave in August, I told us that in February. So I give us enough time to have communication, conversations, understand. So I will advise people, don't tell your spouse, your significant other, a week before you're going to leave your job, that you're going to leave your job. This is a no. Give some time for conversation. And then as, my wife and I, we talk about this and she think about it. We discuss all the different things. And we also have time to understand what the path's going to be, right? It's not going to be that dark and so forth. And then she was able to we were able to say, you know what, let's do that, and also figure out what's the plan B gonna be. What happened? You know, I always tell my wife, well, you know, if that thing failed, I get another job. I clean, you know, one of the things that I'm good at, I was a cleaner. I will clean bank, especially what a better person to clean a bank, which is a security person, right? So I know security well, so I can do that. So that was able to be done, but that's how I was able to do that. It's, I will say, open communication, conversation, give some time for the person who is adverse to really digest that, because that's not an easy thing to tell someone. You're gonna leave a stable job in a so-called stable job and be more risky opportunity and so forth.
Mhm. Great. We have some more questions. I'm having a hard time. Some of these are really long questions. So let's see. Let me go through this one. Though I think Dania already answered it, but entrepreneurship and or real estate investment are clear avenues to building wealth, especially for Black people. Each channel requires capital. How do we ensure that Black persons have equitable access to capital so they can fully participate in these wealth building instruments? Some of it we've discussed, right? Herbie, do you want to give, I mean, you've sought funding. Are there, do you have what's been a really good experience in terms of seeking funding and growing your business?
I think what works for us, again, is an individual answer, not a systematic answer. So I just want to, you know, Dania is sort of teaching me a lot about understanding those two differences. You know, for me, what's helped for me is relationship. You know, as I say earlier, it's about building that village and people that you know and friends that you know, that later on you can ask them for something. You know, I'm always coming a mindset of you build relationship in a way to help people, and then later on when you need help, they will clearly help you. That's how we're able to do that. All the fundings and the opportunity that we have, whether we have in LP money or general partners money, these are friends and people that I know that I've done business with that know me in different aspects of life, able to fund our project. And also, once you do that, they will connect you with the different team and different people that you need to know. You know, in Bacon, I didn't know, I thought before, you know, for many years, I thought the only way to get money is either to a bank or family member. I didn't know there was third parties funding out there, that this is how people's getting money to fund this stuff in a really short period of time. And they move the fund into a regular bank, all those different things to know. The way to know that is through relationships. So that's how I'm able to do that. But we still need systematic change to ensure that there's access to those capital, you know, so people can have great ideas, a great opportunity, a great entrepreneurs, or you get a great real estate. So you can get, there's so much money. Like, for example, the pension fund, you know, there's all these money that a lot of us don't know how to tap into them because we don't have the relationship. But a lot of people, we can have regulations and rules to say, hey, you know what, we're going to put $50 to $100 million on the side to ensure that Black developers and minority developers has the ability to tap into that fund to get to the deal. So there's a lot need to be done from a systematic perspective.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I was just going to add quickly that another systematic, I love those ideas, Herbie. Another sort of systematic answer would be to push for transparency in our banking systems, right? And to individually, we need to be collecting these types of data about when you were discriminated against, right? And not just holding it to ourselves and saying, man, that was awful, right? Like being more vocal about it, being more systematic about putting it out there, right? And holding companies accountable and getting transparency in lending decisions. We need transparency from the credit rating bureaus on what they call their proprietary algorithms and how they do, you know, credit ratings, but it needs to be transparent or it needs to be replaced, right? Like, so advocating for those types of changes as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, one last question, and then I got to hand this back to Mel so we can end on time. So this is kind of a lightning round for everybody. So, you know, because people want to be millionaires, right, at the end of this panel. So, or on their path, I should say. So this is from one of my favorite questions is from the audience. What is your advice for a 5-year plan to build Black wealth post-COVID-19? I mean, these people are serious here. So Melissa, do you want to start?
My short answer is to read The Wealth Choice. I think it was such a very valuable book, and to connect with other meetup groups. The Willie Mindrell runs a Mindrell group, and he did such a great job. He has a whole talk on the blueprint to becoming a millionaire and through real estate. And I joined that probably in like 2015 and got to learn a lot more about buying properties and what that was like. So not only read it, but also act on it and create a community behind it. That's my short answer.
I would say for me is build your village, always building your village. Keep that village as big as possible, different people. It doesn't matter. Just have an opportunity so you can have all type of different people within your village. So when you need that support at any time for that 5 years plan, you can reach out to people that you already know, people that you met, people you work with, people you help, so they can be a part to help you. I think that's what's been good for me. And I think that's one of the ways I can mention.
I would say, along with the theme that I've been on the entire conversation, that couple every individual action you take to build your individual and family wealth, right, with an advocacy or a systemic action, right? So, in addition to the investment that you do personally, advocate for policy with your local, state, and federal representatives, right? Fight back against exclusionary zoning. If you know allies, right? And some people ask, what can I do, right? I have privilege, I'm a white male, something like that. What can I do? Tell them about exclusionary zoning and how they can help, how they can use their power. So for every individual action you take, couple it with a systemic action, because it's probably going to benefit you, but it's definitely going to benefit that next person that needs that push.
I love that. Every individual action, couple it with the systemic, right? Systemic action. I love it. Great way to end this panel before we hand it back to Mel. So anyways, thank you, Dania. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Herbie. Mel is coming back a little bit early, okay? Because you in the audience had so many questions about personal finance. We actually have new ones coming in. One about what should I do? How should I invest my life savings and insurance? Or what do I do about life insurance? What do I do about investment, my savings? There were also earlier questions about estate and wills. So Mel, this is your this is your wheelhouse. So hopefully you can send this panel off about building Black wealth on that note.
Sure. Thanks, Shirley. And I'll just keep it brief because I like things in fives. And so as a financial professional and as a recovering tax attorney, I can talk to you about both. Although I will have to say as a caveat, always check with your attorney or your own financial advisor, because this is not personal or individualized legal or investing advice. Okay, with that out of the way, let's dig in on estate planning. And I think so many people miss this in their wealth journey because you can create all the wealth in the world, and if it's not structured properly, half of it will go to the government, period, point blank. And so when you think about documents, estate planning varies state by state, but there are really 5 things you need to think about. The first thing that's low-hanging fruit is that you have to make sure that you check the beneficiary designations that you have for any retirement plan, life insurance policy that you have. Make sure those are up to date. I've seen families where some nasty surprises happen when there is someone who passes on and they find out that there is stale information on the beneficiary policy. The second thing is that you need a power of attorney for financial decisions. So that's someone who can make financial decisions for you if you become incapacitated, right? And that's actually much more likely to happen during your lifetime as we all live longer. So that's the second thing. The third thing you need is a healthcare directive. Thinking about, again, we could be incapacitated for some time and not able to make decisions for ourselves. Someone who can make those healthcare decisions for you and even make end of life decisions for you. For example, my mother has told me I am not in charge. I am the financial decision maker, but my sister is the one who has the healthcare decisions. And that's for good reasons, she told me. So there you go. The fourth thing you need is a revocable trust. We call it a living trust or what have you. It's something that holds your assets during your lifetime and also has a plan for how those assets are going to be distributed to your loved ones when you're no longer here. That doesn't work though unless you title all of your assets in the name of the trust. You got to do it. And then the fifth thing that you have to do from an estate planning perspective is that you do need a will. Notice the will is the last thing I say, because the will is actually for any asset. I consider it something like a pour over will. It's any asset that you already haven't taken care of during those other decisions. It's an asset that's not in your trust. It's an asset that's not and has a beneficiary designation. Your goal is to get as few assets in your will as possible because you want to avoid probate, because probate comes with fees that your family should not be paying if you had estate planning in place. So that is the 5-point plan for estate planning. Now I'll turn quickly 5 points with personal planning, thinking of along the lines of it is part institutional and part individual, your journey to wealth. First things first, you got to know where your money is and whether it aligns with your priorities. So the first thing you can do is take a step back, take a look. Is your money going to what you think it's going to? You'd be surprised to figure out the answer. The second, you have to use your money with intention. I learned this a long time ago. My grandfather always told me, if your money isn't serving you, it's serving someone else. And that means you have to break it down into buckets. What are your immediate needs? What do you want to invest to improve your lifestyle? And what's going to fund your legacy? Those are the 3 buckets that you always want to think about wealth. The third thing is multiple sources of revenue. Everyone on this panel has talked about that. Dania, you've talked about how we're often our own financial backstop. Melissa, you've talked, and Herbie, you've talked about the need where you're working, but you also have rental income. Or Herbie is a multiple entrepreneur. So you always want to have multiple sources of income because that diversification drives down the risk when one of those pieces of income stops. Fourth, you want to grow your wealth by investing. You must invest to grow your wealth. If you keep it in cash, it will lose power every day. That's how we know we need look no further than inflation. And as Fat Joe would say, yesterday's price is not today's price. It just isn't. And so that is inflation 101. And you've got to invest, if only to keep up with inflation. And then fifth, financial literacy. You should be educating yourself about investment options. I think it was Melissa who mentioned the conversation with her mom as a homeowner. Educate yourself, learn from others, get your kitchen cabinet together. I think that's what Herbie said, and then pass that on to your children. Because what we find is that even if you create wealth in this lifetime, the studies show by the 3rd generation, it's gone. And that is because people are handing down monetary assets and not handing down knowledge. So you have to make sure to have those conversations. And with that, thank you so much, Shirley. I am so excited that this incredible panel came together to have this discussion. If you have further questions about your wealth, I invite you to come visit us. I'd like to give a special thanks to James Jack, who is the head of the business owners segment, and Jim Doucet, who is the head of the New England region. Thank you so much for making this possible. And thank you, Shirley and the Boston Globe, for putting on this program and the great partnership throughout the entire series. We're so grateful to you.